wind came down from the mountains like a living thing that winter, sharp, restless, and cruel. It scoured the high plains, rattling the brittle grass and whistling through every crack in Eli Carter's old ranch house. He'd learned long ago not to fight it. You couldn't outstare the wind, same as you couldn't outlive regret. You just endured it, same as everything else. He was mending the north fence when he saw her. At first, she looked like a heap of rags tangled in the wire, a patch of color against the gray drifts of half-melted snow. He thought maybe a coyote had dragged something there. But then the bundle moved. Eli dismounted slowly, boots crunching on frozen earth. Up close, he saw it was a girl, or nearly a woman, face streaked with mud, hair black as crow feathers, one arm caught in the barbs. Her lips were blue. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. She was Apache, no mistaking it. And in these parts that meant trouble faster than lightning over dry grass. He could have ridden back, said nothing. But something about the stillness in her, not fear, not weakness, but a quiet endurance, stopped him cold. He cut her loose, draped her across his horse, and carried her home through the wind. The sky had turned the color of lead by the time he reached the ranch house. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and old wood. The place was too big for one man, too quiet by half. A rocking chair sat by the window, creaking every time the wind found the walls. His wife's wedding dress still hung in the corner, covered in dust, the lace long gone yellow. He hadn't found the heart to pack it away. He laid the girl down by the hearth, close to the fire. Steam rose from her torn shawl. He fetched water, then whiskey, then an old wool blanket from the chest. Her skin burned hot beneath the grime. He dabbed her forehead, cleaned the cuts on her arm, wrapped the worst of it in strips torn from his own shirt. When he poured a drop of whiskey between her lips, she stirred, eyes fluttering open. They were dark, sharp, wary but not wild. For a long time neither of them spoke. "You're safe," he muttered, though he wasn't sure she believed it. "Rest a while. Then you can go." She didn't answer, only blinked once and turned her face toward the fire. Her breathing steadied. Eli sat back on his heels, hands rough and shaking. He hadn't touched another living soul in months. Not since Mary had gone into the ground out by the cottonwoods. She'd been sick near a year before dying. And when she did, the silence after was worse than the sickness itself. He stood, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and stared into the flames. The snow hissed against the windows. Every few moments, the chair in the corner creaked, as if the ghost of his wife was still rocking, slow and patient, watching him break his own rules again. By morning, the girl was awake. She sat cross-legged by the fire, chewing a piece of bread she'd found on the table. Her shawl was wrapped tight around her shoulders, though it barely covered the bruises at her neck. Eli poured another cup and handed it to her. "Name?" She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the door, the window, then back to him. "Nalin," she said at last, voice low and even. He nodded once. "You from the San Carlos band?" She didn't answer, just looked down into the cup. He didn't press her. He'd learned long ago that some truths weren't meant to be hunted. By noon, he'd gone back to his chores, though his mind kept wandering back to the firelight and the sound of her quiet breathing. He told himself she'd be gone by sundown. He didn't need anyone underfoot, not a stranger, not an Indian girl with trouble painted all over her. But when he came in that evening, she was still there. She'd swept the floor, cleaned the pot, and hung his wet coat by the stove. The air smelled faintly of sage and something floral, a smell he didn't know but somehow remembered. He found her mending one of his shirts, needle moving steady as rain. "You don't have to do that," he said. She looked up, expression unreadable. "Work pays for warmth," she replied simply. Something about the way she said it, calm, unashamed, made him look away. "Suit yourself." That night, as he sat at the table, eating stew she'd seasoned with something sharp and earthy, he realized he hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to anyone in half a year. Her silence didn't bother him. It was a silence that knew how to share space, not fill it. Later, when he stepped outside to bring in firewood, he noticed lanterns flickering on the distant ridge, riders passing. He knew who they were, neighbors from town, the kind who carried rifles and gossip in equal measure. He could already imagine their talk come morning. Eli Carter's gone soft, they'd say. Took up with one of them Apache girls. Let them talk. Still, as he latched the door and turned down the lamp, he felt the weight of it. Out here, a man's reputation could be shot dead faster than a wolf on the trail. He watched Nalin as she dozed near the fire, the light flickering over her face. She was younger than he'd first thought. The bruises were older than the journey that brought her here. Whatever she'd escaped, it had been worse than cold or hunger. Eli sat for a while in the rocking chair. It creaked slow and familiar. For a strange moment, he imagined Mary sitting beside the girl, passing her a blanket, whispering something about kindness, the kind Eli had long forgotten how to show. When the fire burned low, he rose and threw another log on. The sparks leapt high, scattering orange across the dark rafters. He looked at the girl one last time. "You can stay," he said quietly, "until you're strong enough to ride." She didn't stir, but he thought he saw her mouth curve, just slightly, before the shadows claimed her again. Outside, the wind moved through the valley, carrying with it the smell of thawing earth. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes called to one another in the dark. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel entirely empty. The days settled into a rhythm that neither of them spoke about. The snow thawed slow and reluctant, revealing patches of brown earth and the scattered bones of a winter that had bitten too deep. Nalin rose early each morning, moving about the house like someone who had lived there all her life. She swept the floor, milked the cow, fed the horses. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, and silent, the kind of silence that worked rather than lingered. Eli tried to tell himself it was temporary. She'd heal, then go, and the ranch would return to its rightful stillness. But each morning, when he poured his coffee and looked through the rising steam toward her figure in the yard, shawl drawn tight, hair loose down her back, the quiet didn't feel the same. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was presence. She never asked questions, never offered stories. When she spoke at all, it was in short, plain words. Once, when he asked where she'd learned to ride so well, she said, "From watching horses," then nothing more. He found himself respecting that kind of simplicity, maybe even envying it. One afternoon, he came in from the barn to find her standing by the mantel. In her hand was a small length of faded blue ribbon. His breath caught before he even knew why. "That was my wife's," he said. Nalin looked at the ribbon for a long moment, then at him. "It was in a drawer," she said quietly. It wanted air. He almost told her to put it back, that she had no right. But the way she held it, gentle as if it were some small living thing, made the words catch in his throat. Instead, he watched her loop it around her braid and tie it, the color soft against the black of her hair. For the first time in years, he didn't see the grave, or the sickness, or the emptiness Mary left behind. He saw life again, quiet, unassuming, and breathing right there in his kitchen. After that, something shifted between them. They spoke little, but the silences grew comfortable. He noticed how she would hum to the horses when she brushed them, songs without words, full of old rhythms that seemed to belong to the land itself. She cooked with a kind of reverence, grinding herbs with the back of a spoon, tasting the air as though listening to it. The stew she made had depth, warmth, the kind of taste that reminded him what it meant to be alive. But on the prairie, peace was never left alone for long. One dry afternoon, when the horizon shimmered with heat and dust, Eli saw 3 riders cutting across the field. He knew them before they reached the gate. Sheriff Benson led the way, broad-shouldered, red-faced, and full of the kind of authority that had long since curdled into something mean. Behind him rode 2 younger men, rifles slung across their saddles. Eli stepped out to meet them, wiping his hands on a rag. "Afternoon." "Sheriff," he said. "Afternoon," Benson replied, though there was no courtesy in it. His eyes flicked toward the house. "Word is you've got company out here." An Apache girl. Eli didn't move. "Word travels fast. Faster than it should," Benson said. "Folks in town don't like it. They're saying she's part of the bunch that hit a freight wagon near Dry Creek last fall." "Killed a man, maybe 2. Eli's jaw tightened. You got proof of that? Benson shrugged. Don't need proof when fear's doing the talking. He spat into the dirt, eyes narrowing. I'm giving you fair warning, Carter. Send her off before someone else decides to come calling, less polite. Eli's gaze didn't waver. She's under my roof. That's all anyone needs to know. Benson leaned forward in the saddle, his grin humorless. You've been alone too long. Makes a man soft in the head. Don't say I didn't warn you. When they finally rode off, the dust from their horses hung in the air long after the sound of hooves had faded. Eli stood there for a long while, hands tight at his sides. He could still hear the echo of Benson's words, not the threat, but the pity behind them. Out here, pity could kill faster than a bullet. When he came back inside, Nalin was standing near the window watching him. They'll come again, she said. Maybe, he replied. You should have let me go. He shook his head. Ain't in me to turn anyone out into the cold. Her eyes softened. The cold don't scare me, Eli Carter. But hate does. He didn't answer. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of her, and sat down across the table. The room was still but alive, the fire low, the smell of wood smoke and stew thick in the air. After a while, she began to hum. The tune was slow, mournful, carrying the cadence of wind through canyon stone. He didn't recognize it, but it rooted somewhere deep in him, where memory and pain had grown tangled. That song, he said quietly. What's it called? She looked into the fire. It's for crossing over water, she said. For leaving behind the dead. The words sat heavy between them. He thought of Mary, of how he'd never managed to let her go. Not really. The rocking chair still faced the window, waiting for someone who'd never come back. The girl's voice wove through the flicker of firelight, low and steady. It wasn't sorrowful so much as accepting, the kind of song that didn't ask for healing, only recognized it when it came. He realized then that the sound frightened him, not because it was strange, but because it was peace, and he had forgotten what peace felt like. Outside, night gathered over the plains. Coyotes called from the ridges. The wind pressed against the windows, soft as a sigh. Eli leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the tune carry through him. The house no longer felt like a tomb, no longer haunted by what had been lost. It breathed again, faintly, but truly. When the song ended, Nalin rose and fed another log to the fire. The ribbon in her hair caught the light for an instant, blue against flame, life against memory. Eli watched her in silence, a thought stirring like a distant rider on the horizon. Maybe the land hadn't given up on him just yet. The wind began to change before dawn. It came from the south this time, thick and heavy, carrying the scent of wet earth and iron. Eli Carter knew that smell. He'd seen storms break open like judgment before, tearing fences to ribbons and drowning calves in the gullies. He stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, and watched the horizon darken. Clouds rolled low and fast, bruised purple and gray, swallowing the morning light. The air pressed close against his skin, the way silence does before a gunshot. Behind him, Nalin stepped out, shawl drawn tight. She studied the sky for a long moment, her face unreadable. It's coming hard, she said. He nodded. You ever seen one this bad? Storms don't scare me, she replied. It's the waiting that does. By mid-morning, the first gust hit, a long, hollow moan that bent the mesquite and sent dust spiraling through the yard. Eli swung into his saddle before the rain started. The cattle had already begun to bunch low in the fields, restless and spooked. Keep to the ridge, he shouted to her. We'll drive them up toward the rocks. Nalin nodded and mounted bareback, guiding her horse with quick, sure movements. The rain came down in sheets, cold and blinding. Lightning split the sky, turning the world white for an instant, then plunging it back into black. The two of them worked wordlessly, shapes half swallowed by the storm. The cattle bawled, mud sucking at their hooves as they stumbled toward higher ground. Eli could barely see 10 paces ahead, but somehow Nalin moved, as if the land spoke to her, cutting through the chaos with calm precision. At one point, a bolt struck so close the air cracked like a whip. Eli's horse reared, slipped, and went down hard. Pain shot through his leg as he hit the mud. Before he could pull himself free, the animal thrashed again, pinning him by the boot. He shouted once, a useless sound lost to the wind. Then she was there. Nalin slid off her horse and dropped beside him, rain streaming down her face. Her hands moved quick and sure, freeing his foot and hauling him up with a strength that startled him. Together they stumbled toward the fence line, half crawling through the muck until they reached the rise by the barn. By the time they pushed the doors open, the storm had become a living thing, roaring, relentless, determined to wash the world clean of everything weak. Inside, the air smelled of hay, sweat, and smoke. Eli collapsed against a post, chest heaving. Blood ran down his shin, dark against the mud. Nalin struck a match with trembling fingers, shielding it from the draft, and lit the small lantern hanging by the stall. The flame flickered weakly, then grew steady. "You're bleeding," she said. Not the first time. She found an old rag, dipped it in the rainwater dripping from the eaves, and began to clean the gash. Her touch was steady but gentle. He watched her face in the lamplight, the high bones, the calm that didn't quite hide the exhaustion underneath. When she shifted to tear another strip from her shawl, her sleeve slipped from her shoulder. For the briefest second, the light caught on pale ridges of old scars, crisscrossed lines, too straight to be from nature. He froze. The words came before he thought them. "Who did that to you?" She looked at him once, eyes dark and endless. Then she pulled the shawl back up and tied it firm. "People who think pain teaches respect," she said quietly. They were wrong. The rain pounded harder, hammering the roof like fists. Eli stared at the floorboards, jaw tight. He wanted to speak, to curse the world, to say something that might make sense of it. But all he managed was a hoarse whisper. "I'm sorry." "For what?" she asked. "For what the world does to good things." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with everything neither of them had ever said. After a time, he managed a smile, crooked, weary. "You saved my hide out there." Nalin's lips curved slightly. "The land saved us both," she said. "We just listened." Thunder rolled over the hills, softer now, like the last echoes of an old grudge. The storm was passing. They sat close to the lantern, drying by the dim warmth. The light shimmered across the walls, catching in the rain that dripped through the rafters. Eli reached for his flask, took a swallow and passed it to her. She hesitated, then drank. The whiskey burned, but it carried heat, the kind that felt almost like mercy. He watched her then, really watched her. The steadiness in her movements, the quiet strength in her shoulders, the unspoken history in her eyes. She was younger than him by far, yet her silence carried more years than he could count. When he'd buried Mary, he thought the world had finished speaking to him. But now, sitting beside this strange, scarred girl while the storm wept itself empty, he began to wonder if the land had just been waiting for him to listen again. Outside, the wind softened to a whisper. The cattle lowed in the distance, weary, alive. Nalin leaned against the post, eyes half closed. "In my people's stories," she murmured, "storms are spirits. They come to test what's still strong. What's weak, they take with them." Eli looked at the blood on his trousers, the mud caked into his hands, the ache in his bones. Then he looked at her. "Guess we passed then." Her smile was faint but real. "For now." He reached out, meaning to thank her, but stopped himself. Words weren't what was needed. The storm had already said enough. When the last rumble faded beyond the hills, Eli stood and opened the barn door. A pale light spread across the land, the gray-blue glow that comes only after ruin. The air smelled clean, almost sweet. He turned back toward her. "You should rest." "We've got fences to mend come morning." She nodded, eyes drifting toward the open sky. "Fences can wait. The land needs to breathe first." He didn't argue. For once he understood. As he stepped outside, the wet earth clung to his boots, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. The storm had taken half his fences, but it had left something else. Something harder to name, a quiet between two souls who had both learned how to survive the breaking. The storm broke, but its echo lingered in everything. In the smell of wet earth, in the sag of the barn roof, in the silence that followed rain. The land was soft again, pliant. The cattle grazed in the upper pasture where the ground had dried. The ranch, bruised and beaten, had survived. Eli Carter worked with his usual steadiness, though the cut on his leg throbbed under the bandage. He told himself it was healing fine, though the limp said otherwise. Nalin saw it, of course, but said nothing. She had the gift of seeing what a man tried to hide and leaving it be. In the days that followed, she began to plant seeds. She found an old sack of corn and a handful of beans in the pantry, half forgotten from a better season. She worked the soil behind the house with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands dark with earth. Eli watched from the porch, cigarette burning low between his fingers. The sight stirred something he couldn't name, something like hope, or maybe just the memory of it. "You'll lose half to the frost," he called. "Then the other half will learn to fight," she answered, not looking up. He almost smiled. "You talk like this land listens." "It does," she said. "You just stopped hearing it." He had no answer for that. Each evening brought a rhythm that felt dangerously close to comfort. They shared simple meals, beans, biscuits, the last of the canned peaches Mary had put up years ago. Sometimes she hummed while she cleaned the dishes, and the sound filled the space where grief used to sit. Other times they sat in silence, each pretending not to watch the other across the lamplight. But quiet peace is a fragile thing on the frontier. It doesn't take much to break it. One afternoon, Eli rode into town for supplies. The main street was half mud, half dust, the way it always was after rain. He tied up his horse outside the general store and stepped in, nodding to the owner, Cal Jenkins, who looked up from behind the counter with that too-wide smile that never reached his eyes. "Morning, Eli," Cal said. "Heard the storm took a few of your fences." "Repaired most of them," Eli said, dropping a list on the counter. "Need nails, coffee, and salt." Cal looked at the paper, then leaned in just slightly. "You still got that Apache girl out there?" Eli's jaw tightened. "Don't know as it's your business," Cal shrugged. "Town's talking, that's all. Sheriff says it's a matter of time before trouble rides your way. Some folks don't take kindly to—" "That'll do," Eli cut in. His voice was low but sharp enough to make the man flinch. "You got my supplies or not?" Cal handed him the bundle without another word. But as Eli left, he felt eyes on his back, the kind of stare that carried judgment like a brand. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was low. The gatepost was splintered, a bullet hole fresh in the wood. Nalin was in the yard, mending a saddle strap. Her eyes flicked toward the post, then to him. "They came while you were gone," she said simply. He looked around. Tracks in the mud, 3 horses maybe. "You hurt?" She shook her head. "No, they only wanted me to see." Rage rose hot in his chest, but he swallowed it. Anger was a fire that burned the wrong things first. "You're safe here," he said. "Am I?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands had stilled. "Your neighbors think you've gone mad. They spit when they see me in town. I won't be the reason they turn on you." Eli turned away, jaw working. "Let them talk. I owe them nothing." But even as he said it, he felt the weight of his own lie. Out here, a man's reputation was his shield, and his shield was cracking. That night, the air inside the house felt heavy. Nalin was quiet, moving through the rooms with an energy that wasn't rest but decision. Eli sat by the fire, mending a harness that didn't need mending. When he finally looked up, she was by the door, her shawl folded over one arm, her satchel tied shut. "Where you think you're going?" he asked. "East," she said softly. "The river's high, but the land beyond it's quiet." "I'll find work." He stood, the chair scraping against the floorboards. "You won't make it 2 days alone." "I made it this far," she replied. Her calm infuriated him, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. He took a step closer, words rough in his throat. "You belong here, Nalin." She met his eyes unflinching. "I don't belong anywhere, Eli. That's how I've stayed alive." He exhaled sharply, ran a hand through his hair. "If you leave, they'll think they were right, that you were trouble. You want that?" She hesitated. The fire cracked, the lamplight flickered between them. "This place isn't about what they think," she said at last. "It's about what you need, what I need." He snapped. "I need help running a ranch, not—" He stopped himself. but the damage was done. The look that crossed her face was not anger, but something worse. Disappointment. "You don't have to explain," she said quietly. "A man who's lost too much learns to close doors." The silence that followed felt long enough to measure in heartbeats. Then Eli stepped forward, his voice lower, steadier. "You're wrong about one thing," she waited. "You said you don't belong anywhere." "That's not true. You belong where you're wanted, and I—" He faltered, the words caught between pride and need. "I want you to stay." The flicker of surprise in her eyes was brief, almost imperceptible. But it was there. She looked down at the shawl in her hands, then slowly set it back on the chair. "For now," she said. "For now," he echoed. She moved to the window, watching the moon rise over the wet fields. The land shimmered faintly, healed by the storm's passage. Behind her, Eli stood still, the weight of what he hadn't said pressing in his chest. Two souls under one roof, neither quite whole, neither quite alone. The fire burned low, its glow soft against the walls. Outside, a coyote called once and fell silent. And though neither of them would speak it aloud, something had shifted again. A fragile peace, trembling like a new seed beneath damp soil. Dawn came uneasy that morning, thick with the scent of ash and rain. The sky was bruised purple over the plains, clouds rolling low like cattle driven by an unseen hand. Eli Carter stood on the porch with his coffee, watching Nalin scatter feed for the hens. The world looked almost peaceful, but both of them felt it, that hush before a storm that wasn't made of weather. The warning came just past noon. A rider approached from the ridge, the glint of metal catching the light. It was Sheriff Benson, flanked by 3 men, local ranchers, hard-eyed and armed. Dust rose behind them like smoke. Eli stepped out to meet them, the air sharp with foreboding. Benson pulled his horse to a stop at the gate. "Heard you been keeping company that don't belong here," he said, voice oily with mock politeness. His hand rested easy on his revolver, Eli's jaw set. "She's under my roof. That's all you need to know. That's all, huh?" Benson's grin didn't reach his eyes. "Ain't the first time you pitied one of them. But this," he gestured toward the house, "this crosses a line. Folks around here don't take kindly to savages sleeping where decent women used to." Eli's voice dropped low. "Watch your tongue," one of the men spat into the dirt. "We're giving you fair warning, Carter. She's gone by sundown, or we make sure that house of yours burns brighter than hell." Behind Eli, the screen door creaked open. Nalin stepped out, shawl around her shoulders, calm as still water. Her eyes found Benson's unflinching. "You burn what you fear," she said softly. "But fire don't choose sides," Benson laughed, though there was unease beneath it. "Listen to that. Speaks English better than most. Maybe you taught her, Carter?" Eli didn't answer. He just turned and strode toward the woodpile, took a torch from beside the shed, and struck it against the post until it caught flame. He planted it upright in the yard, its fire licking the wind. "You'll get your fire," he said, stepping between it and the men. "But you won't like what it lights." The tension was thick enough to taste, smoke and fear, and the metallic tang of pride. Benson's men shifted in their saddles, hands twitching near their guns. "You mean to fight us over her?" Benson asked, incredulous. "I mean to stand where I said I'd stand," Eli replied. The moment cracked like dry timber. A pistol barked. The torch flared, throwing sparks across the yard. The horses reared, men shouted, and the stillness of the prairie shattered into chaos. Eli fired once, twice, each shot deliberate, like punctuation on a prayer. One man fell, another fled. Benson swung down from his horse, charging through the smoke with a rifle raised. Nalin moved before Eli could stop her. She snatched the old shovel from the woodpile, swung it hard, knocking Benson's aim off course. The shot went wide, splintering the porch post instead of Eli's chest. She turned, fury alive in her eyes, not wild, but clear. She fought like someone who had nothing left to fear. Benson lunged, catching her wrist, and she drove her knee into his stomach, twisting free. Eli fired again, the bullet grazing Benson's arm and spinning him backward into the dirt. For a heartbeat, there was only the crackle of flame and the ragged sound of breathing. Then Benson's men were gone, their hoofbeats fading into the distance. The yard was littered with smoke and silence. Eli lowered his rifle, the adrenaline draining out of him like water from a cracked barrel. He swayed once, caught himself on the porch rail, blood running down his sleeve. Nalin was beside him in an instant. "You're hit," she said, voice calm but trembling underneath. "It's not bad," he muttered, though his shirt was dark with it. She tore a strip from her shawl, pressed it against the wound, and tied it tight. Her hands were sure, practiced. He stared at her face in the firelight, the same calm that had met the storm, the same strength that had dragged him from the mud. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. Her gaze lifted. "Neither should you." They stood like that, side by side, the torchlight flickering against their faces. The yard smelled of gunpowder and wet earth, of fear spent and courage tested. Finally, Eli spoke. "Why'd you run before you came here? What were you running from?" She hesitated, then sank down onto the porch step. The fire cast her shadow long across the yard. "Soldiers came to our village," she said. "They said they were clearing the land for settlers. My father fought. My mother—" She stopped, breath catching. "They burned everything. I walked for 6 days before I fell near your fence." Eli sat beside her, silent. "I thought if I stayed moving, I'd stay alive," she continued. "But when you brought me inside, I realized I didn't know how to be anywhere anymore." The wind rose, carrying sparks into the dark. Eli stared at the flames, seeing not the fire before him, but another, the one that had taken his wife years ago, when fever swept through the valley. He had buried her with his own hands, the scent of smoke in the air even then. He said, "You're not the only one who lost everything." She turned to him. "Then why save me?" He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, steady. "Because maybe saving someone's all that's left worth doing." The silence that followed was softer than before. The world had shrunk to the circle of light around them, to the sound of horses far off, to the beating of 2 tired hearts still alive. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Her fingers were rough, warm, steady against his own. Inside the house, the old wedding dress still hung in the corner, pale, untouched, gathering dust. The wind stirred it slightly, but its days of meaning were done. Tonight, it was nothing more than cloth and memory. Eli looked toward it once, then back at Nalin. "You can stay," he said quietly. "As long as you need," her eyes softened. "And if I choose to?" He nodded once. "Then it's your home too." The torch guttered out, smoke curling into the stars. For the first time in years, the night didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. The weeks that followed passed in the slow rhythm of mending, fences, wounds, and whatever was left of 2 battered souls. The plains began to green again under spring rain, the air scented with mesquite and wet soil. The land had seen blood, but it chose to heal anyway. The lawmen came in due time, a pair of riders in long dusters, their badges dull with travel. They questioned Eli about the gunfight, about Benson and his men. Eli answered straight, steady as an oak. The lawmen exchanged a look, then tipped their hats. "Sounds like justice done itself," one of them said. "We'll let it rest." When they rode off, the silence that followed was clean, not the hollow quiet of grief, but the earned stillness of peace. The ranch began to breathe again. The cattle moved steady in the fields. The seed Nalin had planted after the storm broke through the earth, small green shoots trembling against the wind. Eli rebuilt the corral post by post, his hands remembering what work felt like when it wasn't only about survival. Sometimes, in the golden light of late afternoon, he'd look up to see Nalin standing near the riverbank. Shawl pulled close, face lifted to the sun. There was no fear in her anymore, only that deep, grounded calm that came from belonging, even if only for a while. They worked as partners now, wordless and sure. She helped him brand the calves, her movements precise and strong. He taught her to mend harness leather and measure a fence line by stride. She, in turn, taught him to read the wind, how its change carried messages long before the clouds spoke. "You listen with your skin," she told him once. That's how the earth talks to those who stay. He smiled at that, a small thing, but true. Evenings were softer. The old rocking chair, once a lonely relic of memory, finally stilled. The house felt lived in again. Boots by the door, coffee on the stove, laughter that came quiet but real. Still, Eli knew peace never stayed too long on land like this. Spring would come and the road would call. He saw it in the way Nalin's eyes drifted toward the horizon when the sun went down. She'd been born to the open, and though this place had held her, it couldn't keep her. The morning she chose to leave was bright and clear, the kind of day that promised mercy. She was saddling her horse when Eli stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. For a long moment he didn't speak, just watched her tighten the strap, her braids shining like copper in the new light. "You sure about this?" he asked finally. She looked up, calm as always. "I need to see what's left. The land remembers even when people forget." He nodded slowly. "You'll find it. I will," she said. "And when I do, I'll bring what I can back." He tried to smile, but the words caught in his throat. "Can't say I'm fond of empty rooms." Nalin stepped closer, the horse's reins loose in her hand. "Rooms don't stay empty if the heart behind them's alive." Her voice softened. "Yours is." The air between them held everything unspoken. Gratitude, loss, love that didn't need naming. He wanted to tell her to stay, to say that the ranch felt whole with her there, that her silence had taught him more about forgiveness than 1,000 sermons. But he didn't. Instead, he said the only truth that mattered. "You saved my ranch. Now I owe you more than all the gold in the West." For the first time since he'd known her, Nalin smiled wide enough for the light to reach her eyes. "Then keep it safe," she said. "For both of us." She swung up into the saddle with a grace that belonged to no one's world but her own. The horse pawed once at the dirt, eager for the open. Eli stood with his hat in hand as she rode toward the hills. The sun caught the river beyond, turning it into a ribbon of fire. Her braid glinted in the light, flashing bright, then fading into the distance. He listened until her song reached him, soft, half-hummed, carried by the wind. He couldn't understand the words, but he felt their meaning. It was a promise that healing, once found, never truly left. When she vanished beyond the ridge, the ranch seemed to exhale. The wind shifted, rustling through the young corn in the garden. Eli turned back toward the house. The old wedding dress still hung in the corner, pale in the morning light. For years it had been a monument to sorrow. Now it was just a thing that had served its time. He folded it carefully, placed it inside the cedar chest and shut the lid. Outside, the sky opened wide. The smell of coffee drifted from the stove, mingling with the clean scent of spring rain. He stepped onto the porch, hat low against the wind, eyes tracing the trail she'd taken until it disappeared into the horizon. There was loneliness in him still. Yes, but it was the kind a man could live with. The kind that reminded him he was alive. He walked down to the fence line, the one she'd helped him mend. The boards were new, the nails bright. The land stretched before him, wide, scarred, enduring. He picked up a handful of soil, let it sift through his fingers. "For both of us," he murmured. The wind answered, soft and sure, sweeping across the fields like a blessing. By evening, he'd set another post, patched another rail, and lit a small fire near the porch, not a warning this time, but a beacon. A quiet promise that the ranch would keep standing, just as she'd asked. Somewhere far off, beyond the ridge and the endless sky, a lone rider crossed the plains, her shawl whipping in the wind. And if the world was kind, she might have smiled too, knowing the fire she left behind still burned steady, guiding one man's heart through the long western dusk.